Today I'm with Navjot Altaf, a dear friend, but also a very well-known and important artist in India, and who's, of course, based in India, but has shown her work internationally. You will have a detailed CV in the webpage, but just as a brief introduction, Navjot has a interwoven practice from both looking at theory and methodological innovations, and also combines with the history, contemporary art, film, and cultural theory. She has worked extensively on the problematic of the feminine throughout understanding of Marxist feminist theory in the field of social history of art, cultural and psychoanalytical theory, which is analyzed with historical interests in her own art practice. Just also very interestingly, since 1997, she has been collaborating with indigenous artists, Adivasi artists, and communities in the Bastar region of India, which, as you know, is also a very disturbed region in terms of Naxal movement, etc. But also there's a great stress on indigenous ways of life there. And she has worked collaboratively there as an artist, as I think using, if you want to use the word, social sculpture, or also bringing the works of indigenous artists as part of our own showings of work, and also done long both conceptual works as well as looking at long films showing what's going on there. So it's a deep engagement in ways of life which we don't easily find in contemporary art practices. Of course, she's shown widely all over the world in museums, galleries, you name it, and she's been there. She describes that she lives both in Mumbai and in Bastar. So it's such an honor and pleasure to have you with me, Navjot, and to be part of this project of mine, Samtal, Jameen, Samtal, Jameer, which really talks about equal terrains, equal selves, in a way of how do we think of a world which is multi-species and away from this human-dominated, capitalist-dominated world. And what will those worlds look like? And thank you very much for this conversation, for agreeing to this conversation. And also, it was heartening to know that you were also thinking along similar lines when you received the invitation, as you say. So I'll hand it over to you to start off, Navjot, and then we'll talk as things progress.
Thank you, Ravi, for inviting me for this project, very close to my heart. So in response to the concept of Samtal Jameen, Samtal Jameer, that I'm happy to be part of, which, as you write, is an attempt to rethink and imagine worlds with inclusions and rights for all. I've jotted down a few points which I will quickly read and hope it will generate a dialogue between us. So I would begin with sharing my interest in understanding how to develop a sensibility that could enable me to recognize the difference between the ecological democracy and the representative democracies, and the similarities in the processes we see in external ecosystems and in the processes of our internal ecosystems, and how the human body has much in common with the rest of the living world. So what I want to say is that if by understanding the principles of ecological democracy, we begin recognizing that we are inevitably linked to the planet and not separated but are interdependent, then perhaps we would begin respecting that no single species could encroach into the ecological space of other species and be dominant and violent. So the procedures of representative democracy, in my view, need to be rethought with specific requirements. And even though it's already being scrutinized, it requires constant scrutinization to keep uncovering why the representative democracies in the socio-political systems have not managed to work ethically or constitutionally on the large scale. Because it's not only for those who are elected to form and run the government, or as Jean-Paul Gagnon, a philosopher specializing in democratic theory, points out, he says that it's not just for those who think they are civilized, the chosen, the righteous, the holy, the entitled, or the powerful, which implies that who has it, who is fit for democracy, and consequently who doesn't have it. and is less fit for it. So, less human. So, we can see how the claim to ownership excludes others, and this we have been experiencing till date. Secondly, even though it's being recognized that non-humans are at the risk of irreversible change, largely because of the choices made by the humans as they have created a kind of environment for themselves, what in my view crucial is that we begin understanding and internalizing that ecosystems are made up of living beings such as trees, plants, animals, insects, and microorganisms that are in constant interaction between themselves, and the human body is inhabited by millions of living organisms which all together are known as the human microbiota. So to protect the earth's ecological processes and well-being of all species, their rights, plus to survive as a large family, the need is to invent ways to explore what interdependencies in inter and multi-species relationships mean. And this perhaps can be done by looking to those that have their own democracies. So apart from the access to the scientific and theoretical information, we are also witnessing the consequences of the destructive use of power by human species, because of which the health of ecosystems is deteriorating faster than ever before, and on which in reality all lives depend. So during pandemic, like a student, I became quite curious to know how our lives and lives of animals and plants, etc., depend on democratic principles of communication and communication between cells and microbes in and on our bodies, and they are found everywhere. And how the microbiota and cells in our bodies coexist and fight off invaders to build and to maintain the organism we share, and how the human body fights the problems democratically. So I feel that despite all the information available, most of us either don't want to acknowledge or don't really know that the loss of diversity and extinctions, etc., are happening to human microbiota as well, affecting our health and well-being. So this question put forward by Jean-Paul Gagnon interests me, as he points out that they are the democracies that make us. And if democracies make us, how can we ever have made democracy? And he asks, is democracy human? No. But then again, yes. Because the answer to this question depends upon how we explain democracy. So what we know of the representative democracies and the democratic practices in the human world, it not only excludes certain sections of the societies based on caste, class, gender, economic or ethnic inequalities, it also lacks in-depth understanding of the interrelationships and interdependencies between all sections of the societies. Forget about having a broader perception of connectedness between all living and non-living things in nature. So we can see that human democracies are run with control, prejudices, and favoritism, and they are unfair. And then how the capitalist economies have continued to widen the asymmetries. Even in the context of COVID, the question asked is whether the field of economics is acknowledging the fact that, barring few economists of course, whether COVID-19 impact is internal and is created by humanity's hierarchical approach to the planet. So the need of our time, I feel, is a kind of democratic system, as Vandana Shiva suggests, in which justice is made for humans as much as for nature, unlike a system controlled by the corporations for the corporations. So to imagine an enhanced sustainable culture and new way of thinking and organizing socio-political order built on the facts of interdependencies of life, I feel that studying minutely the indigenous way of life, which supports diverse life on earth and recognizes interdependence inherent in multi-species, perhaps is one way forward for us. You know, my engagement with Adivasi artists and communities in Chhattisgarh not only has exposed me to the consequences of insensitive and destructive procedures of large scale development projects without much concern and care for the vision and lived experiences of local communities living close to nature for thousands of years, including, of course, learning from the shortcomings of certain traditional techniques and its impact on the environment over the years. But it has also helped me to understand their culture and artistic expressions. I would like to share here an example of human-non-human interaction in a ritually enacted oral epic Lakshmi Jagar in Bastar area where I work. It's a story of origin of rice cultivation on earth. So it's a conversation between Ajgal Bhima and a spider. Ajgal Bhima is an associate of the king and queen of the clouds from the upper world. So when he's asked by King Meg to go down to the middle world, he walks miles and miles to reach the spider to ask if it could spin and suspend a thread for him to slide down to the middle world. And the spider tells Bhima that she has not spun any thread due to bad monsoon, and also she is not free because she is busy with her offsprings. But when Bhima offers to take care and feed the spiderlings while she spun the thread, she agrees. So what one gathers from the myth is that the spider is not represented as a being with no ability to think, reason, or act. It has its own independent equal status. And there are a number of other stories within Lakshmi Jagar in various parts of the epic where animals are positioned as equitable partners. You know, looking at what I have personally experienced and am experiencing, and from various other studies, I understand that indigenous cultures world over have believed in coexistence and in developing awareness, enabling them to identify with nature and resources in the landscape around them, with water, forest, land, and not only with living but with non-living things as well. Identifying with water, forest, land also reminds me of the famous slogan Jal Jangal Jameen given by a tribal leader, Komaram Bhim, during an Adivasi movement against Nizams for the Adivasi rights over forest produce and resources in Andhra Pradesh 100 years ago. Of late, I have been reading about the philosophy of kin-centric ecology, which views life surrounding them as kin or relatives, that includes all the natural elements of an ecosystem. I think we can learn from indigenous perception of the human-nature relationship. I was recently listening to Enric Salmon, an indigenous ethnobotanist, speak about the indigenous perception of the human-nature relationship and the need to stop and practice this awareness. To stop, he says, does not mean doing nothing, but it can be engaging in a kind of mindful of awareness. Here I would like to add that I have been looking at things from feminist and eco-feminist perspectives as well. Ravi, I have sent 3 photo sketches to you. Can we see those?
So can you see the first one?
Yes. Yes, I
Would
can
you like
see.
to talk about it?
So in these sketches, I've tried to look at what's happening to nature and the need to reflect and rethink, not only about the human struggle of achievements, but also about the breakdown of the environment and the tensions and conflicts, also the necessity to understand the contradictions between warnings of the environmental scientists plus of people's lived experiences, and the actions of decision makers and the politics behind it. And the juxtaposition of certain images are intended to create an associative connotations. Many of the images used here are from my archive, photographs taken by me or material collated from sources including television, internet, printed media, etc. You know what I find ironically amusing is how the modern industry and makers of machines have borrowed names from nature for the heaviest of machines like the electronic warfare aircrafts, bulldozers, cranes, etc. And they're called caterpillars, spiders, garuda, raven, or cranes. And interestingly, crane is China's national bird, which actually symbolizes peace and longevity. And I remember talking to a cab driver in Shanghai about this, and he laughed and after a while pointed to a construction site near the sea full of all kinds of cranes and bulldozers and said, "Now this is the symbol of China." In this work, if you see, it is an open cast mine site in northern part of Chhattisgarh with caterpillars, the bulldozer, and an image of a huge tree trunk. Thousands of trees have been cut for the highways and for road broadening and the railways, like in many other places, which has impacted both domestic and wild animals. Cattle is dying due to polluted water and coal dust in the air. And the elephants, who it is said migrated to rich forest areas of Raigad and Korba from Jharkhand due to mining many years ago, now in this region too are impacted because of the loss of green cover and the polluted rivers, as the government is continuing to sanction land for mining and industry and for their use of water, and some rivers are being privatized. Right below you see bats, like many other forms of life that are impacted by the environmental degradation, or like these caged animals for food industry. And the road divider in this context is to symbolize procedures of urbanization and how urbanization has always come with a mix of environmental disturbances and modifications, and how the consequences of certain modifications can be so very fatal. And when you meet people who are directly impacted, one realizes how they understand the loss not only of their personal loss of land, but of their cultures, way of life, knowledge systems, their riparian rights, and the environment itself. Here in these sketches, apart from my interest in visual complexity, as the works have many comprising elements, graphs of different density over these images signify the opacity, as reality is layered and complex. So who wants to look through them, who wants to remove them layer by layer? It depends upon each person's political position. So this is one, and then the second one.
I'll go to the second one.
Yes, please. Here if you see, there is an image of a crane called spider crane and a big desert spider, reflection of which is of a dead spider. And for the ecosystem, spiders, if we see, are extremely beneficial. They are useful for the land and farm crops, and they also reduce mosquito-borne diseases. And I found it very interesting to look at the form and design on the machine borrowed by the designers of the crane, very similar to the spiders, but both have different effect on the environment. One contributes to the nature, and the other is used to lift dead trees, dead animals, or the excavated materials and minerals from the earth, or things made out of them. Then right on top there is an old image of a forest mensuration I found on the net, meant to measure the dimensions of the trees in the forest. These images here on the right I've used to indicate the loss of indigenous sense of food production, their local variety of rice or wheat, or the root vegetables and certain millets like ragi and certain herbs, which was their staple diet and was highly nourishing, now are being replaced by the poor quality of government ration given to them under BPL status. And millets like ragi now is consumed more by us for health reasons than them, and the fancy stores, as we know, in the cities are selling them at a much higher prices than what a farmer gets. And agricultural land on which they grew what they thought was appropriate is being forcibly acquired for industrial use. I believe that development is when we also learn to recognize what is better in different cultures and their philosophies, and we don't disrupt knowledge systems insensitively. And when knowingly that natural systems are interdependent, we are forcing them into spaces which are not appropriate for them, it disturbs and injures other systems too. So I've got interested in knowing more about ecological democracy and how the loss of diversity and extinctions of species are also happening to human microbiota, affecting our health and well-being, as microbiotas are present in every living being. And here in this sketch, I have shown it around the tree roots. You see, the principles of human democracies are discussed at school level, but not the principles of ecological democracy so commonly. So, in many ways, I feel we don't know enough, and I really hope now the schools are making the young aware from the early age itself. This sketch is about what I said in the beginning, that perhaps by looking at the principles of ecological democracy, we can begin to think and develop a broader perception of connectedness between living and non-living things in nature, and about the interrelationships and interdependencies between all sections of the societies. And here I'm looking at some of the insects which are extremely beneficial for the land and farming. And I did this work as villagers' non-violent protests in Chhattisgarh to save their agricultural land, and the protests of the Indian farmers not succumbing to farm laws passed by the government are going on. So, from a broader perspective, these protests seem extremely relevant to me, because apart from the land ownership, there are various other interrelated issues that we need to look into. This human figure here is sensitively trying to build a relationship with another life form, and he can be an indigenous person or anthropologist or a scientist or just a nature lover. You know, I'm interested in the process of making art or experiencing of art, and what evolves from my research and experience, learning from different sources and possibilities and challenges I face in different situations and the context I work in. How does one edit and re-edit by organizing and reorganizing, or conceptualizing and specifying one's ideas and materials? So here I would like to share how did the title of one of my video film, Soul, Breath, Wind, a shorter version of which will be on the website of this project, emerged from both how a farmer whose land has gone into mining expresses the situation by pointing at the site we stood at, and she says that soul of the earth is being removed. This is the end. This is the end. And from the philosophical perceptions in relation to why we cannot exist outside the environment, I would like to quote from Sasha Kagan's wonderful book, Art and Sustainability. And the quote is, "The invisibility of the air is the soul of the visible landscape." Also, the word psyche in ancient Greek signified not only the soul or mind, but also breath and wind. Similarly, Atma in Sanskrit is soul, air, and breath. And if we see these things in today's context, and we all saw how shortage of oxygen killed many during COVID. And if you see right on top in the left corner, just above a sparrow, an oxygen cylinder is placed opposite a sprouted plant on the right side, as plants need oxygen to germinate. Then there are a number of insects around it that contribute to food we live on. So these works are layered as reality is complex, and the layers need to be peeled, or I would say holes need to be made to peep in. And in the middle you can see a Native American woman weaving a basket or a mat with a pattern borrowed from the patterns on the skins of a crab or a lobster. And even in Nagarnar, where I have lived and worked with weavers community, one can see certain patterns which must have evolved from nature. And in theory, I like Gregory Bateson and John Dewey's ideas of aesthetics based on a sensibility to patterns that connect at multiple levels. And right below in the middle, you see a crane bird, not a machine this time. And on the right, an elephant is crossing a divider, perhaps wanting to move towards its desired environment from the environment in a state of chaos that it was forced into. And on the left is an image of an Adivasi person from my archive. He's walking, and maybe while walking he's attentively listening or observing the surroundings, or would be touching things around. This man is an elderly person who performed in Lakshmi Jagar and has told many stories when I went to Bastar in 90s. And just above that is the conversation I have inscribed between Spider and Ajgal Bhima I mentioned earlier. For Ajgal Bhima, I have taken an image of a local actor from a play Lal Pani based on displacement during Hirakud Dam, which was also performed at Dialogue Center by Mirror Theatre during one of our seminars. This image and the text are there in the second work as well. I have incorporated this story to point out that the relationship of interdependence between human and non-human we find in our myths and epics, but don't normally internalize the philosophical aspects of the narratives. See, in this work, the image is not clearly visible, as I want the viewer to come closer. And the text is same, one is in Hindi and the other in English. The original is in Halbi. And then there are birds I normally notice in my surroundings, but in COVID, I noticed many more which may have been there, but I had not noticed. So the background that I have used in these three works, one with the diagonal is a still from a black and white film agitprop train made in the 1920s, and images of a wheel of the train to signify the cultural resistance. And the other is one of my watercolor drawings I had done many years back and had almost discarded, but liked it now for its abstract nature and color tones. Juxtaposition of certain images, as I said earlier, are intended to create an associative connotations. Have repeated many of these images in other works. I like using both associatory and contradictory imagery, or ideas combining of scientific and artistic approaches. And I don't believe in holistic thinking models.
They look very much like works. You say they are your sketches.
Well, these are ideas put together, and I like doing that. And ideas for my installations might emerge from this series of sketches. And now, when you see them all together,
well, they look wonderful.
see here in the middle sketch, you see the spider and Ajkal Bhima a little more clearly. So when you see the triptych, you see things in relation to one another.
How long does it take you to do a thing like this?
You mean one work? Sometimes a week, sometimes less or more than that. It all depends upon how things move. The material normally is collated over period. And I like the idea and effects of copies, which create translucent effects. And in the beginning of the pandemic, I was watching news and discussions on number of national and international channels, क्या हो रहा था उस वक्त सभी देशों में, and was taking photographs from the television itself. And simultaneously, there were so many other things happening. You know, the students and CA protests, China border conflict, Pakistan, India or Kashmir issue, farmers' protests, or Israel-Palestine conflict, various other things all around the world. So these 3 sketches are from the series of 25 I've done on various issues, and also have done a work on farmers' protests. It's a triptych like this. I very much wanted to be part of both Shaheen Bagh and farmers' rallies, to be with them. And a number of my activist friends, were coaxing me to travel to Delhi, but with no trains, no flights, plus COVID in initial stages, had created a kind of fear atmosphere, and I didn't travel. Yet these protesters were out in the open, continuing to voice their disagreements against authoritarian approach of the government.
Yeah. You raised a number of very interesting points, and if you like, we can discuss some of them.
I would like to add one thing. When I talk about indigenous communities or indigenous way of life, I'm not trying to romanticize it.
Yes, you make that point. I wanted to.
I had seen traditional furnaces used to make iron tools for agricultural or hunting purposes in the villages closer to the forests in Bastar district. But I was shocked to read. I have a friend, an anthropologist, Chris Gregory from ANU in Canberra. He has been researching in Bastar area since the 80s, and he has written a book on tribal economy, and we communicate regularly and talk about what each one of us is doing. So once he sent me a research paper on traditional techniques of iron smelting and tribals practicing iron making by using traditional furnaces in India, and how because of the laws and ban on the cutting of trees right from the colonial times, number has decreased. But what was shocking was the amount of clearing of forests and uprooting of trees which went into prepare charcoal to produce iron. It seems to make 1 kg of kacha koila, about 7 to 8 kgs of dry wood was burnt.
Wow, and that they burn in the furnace then?
Yes. So you see, indigenous communities have been using the traditional techniques of making wrought iron by using massive amount of wood for thousands of years. And I remember one of the sessions at House of World Culture's Anthropocene seminar that dealt with this whole question of Anthropocene in relation to pre-industrial revolution period.
It's a very live discussion. When was the starting point of the Anthropocene era? What do we mark that starting point?
It's not to justify them, but now if we see, it is occurring at an unprecedented speed, and the modern techniques are damaging nature even more aggressively and quickly. But despite so much research and information and various discussions on the issue of developing a sustainable culture, and a number of people from different disciplines thinking about how to imagine and make possible the multi-species living, like this project, In reality, a very small section of the world is interested in it. And people in general are not consciously rethinking about changing their ways of life, or because most are caught up with the capitalist generated idea of maximizing the wealth and power, and the idea of more and more accumulation of material goods. So personally, I agree with the idea of finding a way out of excessive consumerism, which I suppose can help. So the unavoidable urgent need, I believe, is to create an awareness at a large scale by working towards co-creating the environment in which both human and non-human and nature flourishes, and we avoid destructions of cultural dynamics.
So two or three things which are very, I think, important to delve deeper. One is this point we've made now, saying that do not romanticize. Would you like to say more about that? Because it's a very important thing, I think.
Yes, the example I gave of iron smelting, we can't overlook how to make good quality of charcoal, logs and logs of sal timber was burnt. So we can imagine the loss of sal forests cut for thousands of years. So it's important to look at any culture from a larger historical and critical perspective. Though I feel that certain values inherent in some old cultures, relevant to present times, we can sustain and learn from. But the point also is that even though Adivasis smelted iron for their own usages, their skills were used to fulfill the requirement of other classes as well, for weapons and construction purposes. And till date, despite the strict laws, they are being used illegally for clearing of the forest by all kinds of people in power. Even though all kinds of police forces, military and helicopters and drones, etc., are employed to check on Naxal activities. But Adivasis or the poor are used as cheap labor by the privileged non-Adivasi population all the time. But Ravi, in relation to this, I would also like to look at the socio-political and economic complexities of the contemporary societies and how some values in present times or present systems are continuing to numb and stifle some important dimensions of human sensibility, which seem to be able to recognize the ecological dynamics. And as a number of research projects reveal, are still alive in some indigenous populations living close to nature, and they seem to have a broader perception of connectedness. You know, I always tell my colleagues that even though I read, but the process of research teaches me more. One has to be amongst them in their environment to sense their idea of coexistence and human-animal relationships. For example, a very special dance performance like Kokerenge, which means cock-like walk, when I first saw in Narayanpur in the open, which went on from midnight to early morning to come to a full circle, I could feel the moments of sensorial intimacy. It's both a ritual and an artistic expression in my view, and makes one feel the poetic dimension of Adivasi existence. Kokerenge is performed after harvest, and the performers travel from village to village to pay tribute to their head of all deities, which symbolizes the entire earth. It's one of my favorite performances, and I like to share it with everyone.
The other point which is very important to talk about in your practice is you talk about the ecofeminist approach and the ecofeminist awareness.
Yes.
And how do you think of that in the idea of nature per se, but also in your interaction with the indigenous communities? How does that marry? These are contemporary approaches, ecofeminism. So how is there a way forward there? So both on how do they marry, any examples, and that can we learn something from that?
Well, as I said earlier, I understand that ecofeminist awareness is based on the concept that all life forms are connected, and their consciousness focuses on ecological relationships and sustenance and nurturing. And I see these values present in indigenous cultures as they both support idea of diverse life on earth. And creatively, eco artists work towards not only making visible the environmental complications we confront, but they also look at the ecological dynamics to regenerate the damaged environment. And my collaborative project of dechoking of 180 trees in Delhi at Barakhamba Road, you may remember, in a way was based on the idea and possibilities of regenerating the damaged trees. And when artwork does not end in a complete product to be viewed and sold, rather to what extent the process can make a difference to the trees and other living beings in the surroundings. So the aesthetic principle that I want to associate with this, which inquire into the meanings and implications of justice in a pluralistic way.
You've seen this, you've worked and lived with the indigenous community for a long time. How do you see the relationship with nature? A lot has been said about, but what is your experience? How are they really reciprocal? Are they really respectful? Do they only take as much as they need, as they keep people say? What is your personal experience of that?
Ravi, my personal experience has been that those who are closer to the cities or towns, like Kondagaon is a district town, and those who live in the interiors are different.
And how?
For example, those who are living in Kondagaon and are somewhat better off are more influenced by the non-Adivasi cultures, like business communities or the government officials. For example, the way they build their homes. I noticed that they have been drifting from nature and are easily giving up use of their sustainable materials that they had been using for centuries. Of course, they have all the rights to change, but I think any change without giving thought to what can be retained can be harmful for their health or their environment and for many other reasons. I often tell the shopkeepers who sell asbestos sheets to the poor without informing them about the possible risks of diseases like cancer and also the heat related diseases in summer, as temperature in this area sometimes rises above 45 degrees. And since terracotta tile roofs demands repair from time to time and getting wood from the forest is restricted now, they are using asbestos. But when one goes to the interiors, to Chota Kurusnar or Mardapal villages, where I've stayed with my colleagues, one can see the use of traditional material, where they build their own homes, make their own bricks and terracotta tiles. And in those villages, Gram Sabha decides how much wood can be cut for building a house. Here one finds each house surrounded by beautiful old tamarind, mahua or neem or many other trees. In their artistic expressions, whether on memorial pillars or in ritualistic or celebratory performances, integration of nature is clearly visible. As many of the dancers wear masks resembling animals and birds, and dancers also together take an animal posture while dancing. And as I said, how in Kokerenge I could sense their reciprocity with the non-human. And I've also seen how totems of different tribes refer to specific animals or plants or other life forms, and don't kill and eat their own totem signs. So in a way, the totems involve prohibition against killing their own totem animals. And a lot has been written about this and this research available. But according to Jaydev Bagil, a well-known Adivasi artist and a very good friend of mine. If tribes did not have these taboos, everybody would have killed every animal. I've also been to a Gond village in the interiors, which is named after a huge, beautiful champa tree at the entrance of a village. And village is called Champa.
Interior means how far away from the city?
Say about 40 to 50 kilometers. Interiors can be 10 kilometers away as well. Rajkumar, my colleague, lives only 8 to 10 kilometers away from our center dialogue in Kundagaon. And he has to pass through a scanty forest area, but there is a police chowki on the way where villagers can see the jeeps carrying the police forces with guns going towards interiors where Naxals are suspected to be. And as I said, 40-50 kilometers inside towards Mardapal or beyond, one can sense the forest, though the security is tighter, but people have to move around. I've been there many times.
Oh, really? And wild animals come there?
They do. They say they see wild animals.
And how do they deal with them?
You see, if the wild animal is not disturbing them or harming anything or anybody, they let them go. They say they have seen tiger in their area. It's very interesting how these stories or experiences are interpreted. When asked if they have seen the tiger, the reply in general is that no, I have heard. It comes at 2 at night, and other will say early morning at 4 or 6 in the morning. It's very interesting listening to them. And so I spent time with them to understand how, even in their own areas, how they experience life, how they imagine things, or how they like to narrate their own experiences to others. But I have read about incidents in Bastar area when villagers had to stay indoors till the tiger was captured by the locals and forest department. But they are scared and alert about animals like lakarbagga, hyena, as it takes away their chickens or other small domestic animals like goats or so, and human babies in some cases, I'm told. I have seen a disturbed elephant near the displacement sites close to scanty forest areas and the people trying to pacify it. And elephants crossing road in Katgora forest close to Raigarh. People normally stop and let them cross.
Okay. But there must be a lot of songs and myths and rituals which deal with animals.
Yes, there are many rituals, that deal with animals, and I've been to some. For example, there is a festival called Gobardhan in Bastar. The family cooks food made of all the grains grown in that area, which is eaten then together by the family members and the domestic animals from the same supa or supri, a winnowing fan, beautifully made out of bamboo.
From the same? That's unique. The animals are like part of the family.
Yes, as part of the family. And this ritual, as you said, signifies their acknowledgement of the animals as part of the family. And it also recognizes the animal's contribution towards food production because gobar or cow dung is manure. Then on Amus Tihar, another ritual, also called Haryali, animals are given shots of medicinal herbs for them to remain in good health. Also, I've seen beautiful forms of animals made of terracotta for the offerings at sites like sacred groves in forests, which are meant to be reservoirs of the rare vegetation.
So, Jess, I want you to, from your experience, that because these people have such a long association with living in nature, in a way, in that with the animals and having a different relationship with them. Of course, when they feel threatened, they'll do something. Otherwise, they just let it be. So, do you think that there's also something which makes them different from inside? They don't have this, like the city idea of animal, the idea of fear is different, the idea of respect is different.
You see, the way they address or speak to animals now. I've seen many people in Bastar and have observed Kumar and Shantipai more closely. They're very gentle. You know, for example, if a cow from the neighborhood enters the compound of Dialogue Center, they don't run with a stone or a stick behind her. Or if they are calling a cow, they do it so gently that I always wondered whether the animal could even hear the sound they make. I asked them once and they said that the animals can sense even from the distance who is going to be hostile to them and who is not. Also, to send the cow away from the compound, they pat her and slowly turn her body towards the gate.
Almost like a fellow being, you know?
Yes, like a fellow being. People in general I've seen are gentle and not afraid of animals. But you know, there are rare people I've seen very indifferent towards their cattle or the pets. They are concerned as long as the animals have done what they are supposed to do. In fact, a dog of my well-known Adivasi friend almost became my pet.
Why?
Because Moti was accepted only as a guard near their gate, but none of the family members ever patted him. He was given good food, but he would leave that and come to my place. I lived in a small place at Shilpigram.
Oh.
I touched and patted him, talked to him, cleaned him, as he used to get skin problems. Like I said, that family was of the belief that dogs are only meant to be the guards at the gate. So when Moti went closer to them, he was shooed away. Not aggressively though, but from the distance. And once I had come to Bombay for a month, and when I returned back to Kondagaon, I didn't see him. I was told that he was hung, as his skin problem had become acute. So no one ever took him to a vet or he got any home treatment. He was killed. He was killed instead.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Sad.
Yes, very sad. Dogs are like companions and very protective towards the human.
So 2 questions I want to ask finally about. One is you come from a left background. You've been influenced and you have been participating in the left movement in your university days and later also. And the left did not always have a very recognizing view of the idea of nature. They were talking about social justice, but nature was the old left. I'm talking the old left.
Yes.
Because things have become more complicated now. So how did your interest in going to Bastar, where did that come from? And how did this integrate? Because your work integrates so many natural signals. You know, so many of your works have natural signals in them, have ideas of nature destruction or nature resonances or, you know, poetic nature as part of your work, if you're looking at society.
You see, the old left at that time was more concerned about the classless society, social inequalities, land issues, or peasant and labor union movements. And I was exposed to the left ideology through students group I interacted with outside art school and through Altaf in early 70s when I met him.
Altaf, your husband, who was a wonderful artist in his...
Yes, he was an artist. He had come from England in the late 60s and the left movement there was protesting for civil rights, nuclear disarmament and the environment. Here in India, left was not engaged with nature or gender. Though we were aware of Chipko in the 70s, which in fact raised issues related to environment, which now when one looks back, had to be seen from environment and women's perspective. But issues concerning environment and nature was not part of the left discourse at that time. But a few years later, some of us, mainly women members of Proyon, got interested in women's movement in Bombay and later in questions raised on feminism in this part of the world. What I would like to add here is that late 80s and early 90s was also quite a stimulating period, and most significant for me was access to writings by the feminists on women's intervention in art histories and cultural studies in the West to begin with. Artists were dealing with the issues concerning minority cultures and recognizing the significance of different knowledge systems, you know, women as subject, nature, and the relationship between the changing technology, etc. So my going to Bastar and engaging with the indigenous artists was my political choice at a time when I was doing sculptures and took references from prehistoric and indigenous cultures and women's writing in India. Then moving towards collaboration with Adivasi artists and communities with the project at hand pump sites evolved from our interest in the politics of inclusion and environmental issues. So over period, apart from the aesthetic and hygienic concerns, we also got interested in knowing the causes of decreasing groundwater levels and availability of fresh water in relation to increasing industries around the villages. As in Dantewada side, it was iron ore mining that polluted the rivers and other water bodies, and privatization of rivers like Kello River in the northern Chhattisgarh affected the riparian rights of the local population. And simultaneously in Bombay, close to where I live, Bandra Kurla complex was also coming up vigorously on a very large area of Mithi river bed, and that low-lying areas on both sides of the river actually used to take care of bringing rainwater of many areas to Mahim Creek, where Mithi merged with the sea. Almost every monsoon, suburbs along this river get flooded and roads get damaged and everyone gets affected. So consciously, unconsciously, one begins thinking, and also we are experiencing the negative consequences of this kind of development and environmental degradations at various levels, not only in one city, one state or one country, but around the globe. Only the scale may differ. So my engagement with issues concerning environment has been there since the 90s. Last point I want to make is that in Bastar area, when the government and the corporate companies force people to sell their land, I've seen activists from the left like CPI helping the villagers. No one else comes forward. What I'm saying is that the support from these activists is really appreciated by the villagers. I've spent time with the farmers in Londigura area where Tata Motors wanted to acquire land of 10 villages close to Indravati River and Chitrakoot Falls, one of the most beautiful and fertile area that I've seen. And ultimately, villagers won because of their continuous resistance. And for them, the land is a site of spiritual significance as well. And as I said before, many rituals are performed on the land they cultivate. So you see, the relationship to land is different.
Yes. Land is not only terrain, it's a whole.
Yeah.
One last question I want to ask you is, you talk of ecological democracy, including in your sketch, or as you call it, your sketch, but beautiful sketch. And then you talk of complexities of relationships on the ground, which you've seen with your own eyes. Even indigenous people have that their layered kind of relationships cannot be romanticized. And you also see, as an old left person, you see these differences in class and caste, which is so many hierarchies. What is your sense that when we talk of ecological democracy, are we being too idealistic? Or do you think that is this possible for human society to do? And if it is, what would it take for us to do it?
So thinking about a new way of organizing a society that, as Chomsky says, could be the one that conceives of a social and political order where profits are not above people. I would say that where profits are not only above people, but not above any other living organisms either. And the principles of ecological democracy, in my view, make us aware that we are unavoidably linked to the planet and are not separated from nature. I think the need is to create awareness concerning the reality of interdependencies and why no one species can dominate. Also, I think that the transition requires an ethical and a spiritual base. By spiritual, I mean a philosophical foundation and not only the pragmatic rationality alone. So, I personally feel that it's not idealism. Present societies can learn from both scientific factors and certain values still present in indigenous cultures around the world, and should go more and more for technologies which are not harmful. I would like to mention here how a community based initiative started in Gare village in Raigad to produce solar energy for the use of those villages which have been badly impacted. And they put together a few acres of land aside as a cooperative for their own solar plant. They want to continue farming and strengthen the role of Gram Sabha so that the decision making involves maximum number of people. And a village in Jharkhand has also got electricity through solar with their own initiatives at a small scale. I've been to Gare a number of times and I'm amazed at their sense of hope and their idea of non-violence, especially those who are directly affected by coal mining and have lost their agricultural land and know what they have lost and will be losing if coal mining doesn't stop. I think change is possible if we are willing to change. And we have to see which lens we want to see the world from and any specific problem. I've learned a lot by being with people who are directly impacted and know what loss means and are still resisting so that what is left is not destroyed. You know, there is a whole history of Adivasi struggles against the dominant classes and the colonizers we normally are not even exposed to. So I hope that despite the complex, entangled situations, there are emergence of new initiatives and more voices. And we can see the recent examples from many other countries. I personally believe in collective actions and feel that we can't just give up. And we must reject any form of authoritarianism.
And it's wonderful coming from you, who had such a lot of ground experience of seeing this close up, not just theoretically, but in a very practical, everyday way. It makes you the artist you are and the thinker you are. And I think it's very wonderful to hear that hope, optimism from somebody like you, because when you say it, I really feel that we can do it.
Like I just said, people's non-violent movements have been emerging against injustice throughout the world. And in Raigad, people's non-violent Koila Satyagraha movement is based on Gandhi's civil disobedience principles of refusing to cooperate with injustice.
So Gandhiji is as relevant as ever.
Well, he is in many ways, and I like certain things he practiced. I know a number of people who react to his ideas and ways of imagining the growth of the country.
Not everybody can be a Gandhian. It's not a question of life.
Do you know what interests me about Gandhi and his philosophy? Is his idea of coexistence in nature and relationships between different sections of the societies. And he was in favor of an idea of cultural interdependence and not of colonization and domination. So in many ways, I feel that we are rethinking about what he said years ago. I only sing the line, Ishwar Allah Tero Naam, Sabko Sanmati De Bhagwan, and not Raghupati Raghav. I was sad to see at a nature cure center near Pune, started by Gandhi and one of his followers, this particular line added by Gandhi to promote harmony between Hindus and Muslims at that time is not sung anymore. It has been removed.
Really? Wow. It's changing.
So, exactly.
So with that, I want to thank you, Navjot. Lovely conversation, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you, Ravi. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yes, it is lovely conversation, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I will, of course, share it with you, and then before I share it with the world.
Thank you, Ravi.